I do appreciate coming to talk to you all today. I'm going to discuss a little bit about what's going on in Lake Erie, some of the critical issues facing Lake Erie and the Lake Erie ecosystem, and tell you a little bit about what we're doing to try to solve some of those issues. So if you've never heard of Ohio Sea Grant, because a lot of folks haven't, we're a partnership between Ohio State University and NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So I'm kind of like 50% government researcher and 50% Ohio State Extension professor. I also teach in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Science at Case. I actually had to teach 2 classes last night, so my voice is a little hoarse. I apologize. But I'm one of 5 folks. We all live along the coast, and we do research. And we take the results of that research and we do education programs like this. And we also spend a lot of time trying to inform decision making. So I'll work with the City of Cleveland Mayor's Office of Sustainability, or I'll work with Cleveland Metro Parks or other organizations to try to inform their decisions about how to either protect or in some cases restore the aquatic environments along Lake Erie. You can see we have a few different things we do, whether it be protecting healthy coastal ecosystems. We run the Lake Erie Charter Captains Conference. We do a lot of work with aquaculture. Most of my research focuses on a few different things, most notably climate resilience, watershed management, and plastic pollution. I also get to spend quite a bit of time out at Stone Laboratory. So if none of you have heard of Stone Lab, this is Ohio State University's aquatic ecology lab. It is our island campus, and it's right off of Put in Bay. So if you were to hop in one of these little boats and come to about here, you'd end up on the boardwalk on Put in Bay. Students could take courses all summer. We have visiting researchers. From what I hear from students, they enjoy taking the little dinghies at night over to Put in Bay and then, trying to make it back to the island at night. It sounds like a lot of fun, actually. Usually I'm working, but if there's certainly lots of opportunities for field trips or open houses. If any of you like to travel and get on the water, I highly encourage you to check it out. There's our URL at the bottom. Okay, so a few slides sort of on background of Lake Erie and what makes it really special, and then we'll talk about some of the issues it's facing. I really like this map. This is a cross-section of the Great Lakes, and it shows Lake Erie here, which is, how deep do you think Lake Erie is, if you had to guess? About 200 feet at its deepest. Now that alone doesn't make it unique, but if compared to other of the Great Lakes, for instance Lake Superior at 1,300 feet deep, it does make it unique. So it is by far the most shallow of all the 5 Great Lakes. It's also the most southern of the 5 Great Lakes. That means it's definitely the warmest. It gets the most sunlight that could help produce algae, the building blocks of life. So we have the most diversity of life, the most abundance of life in Lake Erie, but we also have some things working against us. So here are the 5 Great Lakes, and this graph shows land use. So unfortunately, we have Lake Erie here. Certain land uses are good for water health and aquatic ecology, and some are very bad. When we're looking at residential development, you would think that less people living really close to the water would be good, because that would mean less pollution dumping into the lake, less sedimentation. Unfortunately, we have the most residential development in all of the Great Lakes. So we're last on that list. If we move to cropland is really important because we know with agriculture, especially large-scale agriculture, anytime you're putting phosphorus and nitrogen-based fertilizers on land, some of that's going to wash off into the lake. And this could cause algal blooms and other problems. When it comes to cropland, we are also first out of the 5 Great Lakes. When it comes to pasture cows make a lot of manure really high in phosphorus. We're also second in that. And then we are least of the stuff that we really want, forests that help filter some of that excess runoff, that could help capture excess nutrients, stop sediment running into the lake, and we only have 10% of wetlands. And wetlands are also fantastic at capturing runoff and excess nutrients and all the stuff we don't want. So we have this really unique ecosystem in Lake Erie. We have a really warm lake, which is fantastic for life. But unfortunately, it has a lot of people living around it and a lot of agriculture and a lot of incompatible development. So it's, I would like to think, the most sort of prolific lake in terms of diversity, but also the most threatened. And I really love this map. Does anybody know what type of a map this is? This is an underwater map. It shows depth underwater in Lake Erie. Bathymetric, whoever said that, good job. We got some scientists in the room, I like it. Usually people have no clue, so good work on that. And it is interesting, and we'll come back to this later, I like to think of Lake Erie almost as 3 separate lakes. You know, out here in the eastern basin by Erie, PA, that's where it's 200 feet deep. If you go right off of Cleveland, you get to about 75 feet. But out here in the western basin, which is where the Maumee River dumps in, and a whole lot of that excess phosphorus and nitrogen, gosh, most of it's no more than 25, 30 feet deep. So again, this really unique space where sunlight could rain down through the water column and make some of the algae grow, and that could cause good stuff for the ecosystem, but also sort of problems too. So we'll come back at that. These are the issues I'm going to discuss today, and I'll sort of rifle through these. Invasive species, algal blooms, coastal storms, marine debris, and toxic legacy sediment. And that, of course, is right down here in Menor at Menor Headlands. Okay, starting with invasive species. For those who haven't heard this term before, invasive species are just any organism that's living somewhere it doesn't belong. It was transported there by all various different means. Unfortunately, Lake Erie has quite a few. If we were to think of the Great Lakes, how many invasive species do you think are living in the Great Lakes? Take a guess. You shook your head first, so you have to answer now. 10? Do I hear 11?
Like 3 dozen or something?
185. And counting, unfortunately. So we're not going to spend all night going through all 185, but I do want to focus on 3 or 4 that I think are kind of the most hazardous. First is my favorite, this sea lamprey. This is actually the lamprey's mouth. So this is a parasitic organism. What it does is it suctions onto the side of healthy fish, and it literally sucks nutrients out the side of it. Really nasty. And the reason they're in the Great Lakes, including Lake Erie, is 100% our fault. These sea lamprey are native to the North Atlantic. So, as you might imagine, they couldn't make it above Niagara Falls until we designed and built the Welland Canal. You know, the Welland Canal is important because it allows ships to go around Niagara Falls. Really important for economics and trade. But in addition to creating a path for ship traffic, it also created a path for invasive species like the sea lamprey. We're definitely trying to get rid of them with biological agents called lampricides. They actually don't do as good in Lake Erie as some of the other Great Lakes because they like really clear, cool waters to reproduce, but they are in there, unfortunately. And no, I've never heard of a human being get one stuck to them. I always get that question. I don't think that's happened. Next, zebra and quagga mussels. I kind of lump those together. These are filter feeders, so what they do is they eat the good algae. That's some of the building blocks of life in the Great Lakes. They came over in the ballast water of ships. Actually, all 4 of these came over in the ballast water of ships. So ocean-going vessels, when they're in port anywhere around the world, they like to sit up high in the water. Most ocean-going vessels have an empty space at the very bottom called a ballast. When you get out of port, you fill it up with water so the boat sinks down in the water column. It makes it much more stable when it's making that cross-ocean traverse. And then when it gets into the St. Lawrence Seaway or the Great Lakes and it wants to rise up a little bit to make it through that canal, it dumps the ballast water. But unfortunately, if that water was captured in Singapore or Buenos Aires or somewhere else, it's going to dump all the species that it captured when it filled up with ballast water. So we now have regulations preventing it, but unfortunately they're too little too late. And these are 4 of the main species that came over in ballast water that are unfortunately impacting our lakes. We actually went down at Stone Lab with scuba diving and cameras, and the whole ground was moving with round gobies. You know, if you remember like Indiana Jones, remember when he fell in and the whole ground was covered with snakes? Picture that with round gobies, and that's what it looked like on camera. Really crazy stuff. But Lake Erie water snakes like them, so I guess there is an upside, right? Next are Asian carps. These scare me worse than anything. There's 4 varieties. They were likely introduced on purpose into farm ponds. The top 2 are filter feeders. Grass carps, as the name indicates, like to eat vegetation, and black carp actually are carnivorous. The problem with these suckers is if they start to reproduce and get a foothold, they'll just wipe out the whole ecosystem. We haven't found reproducing carps in the Great Lakes yet, but it is an incredible scare. Many of you might have heard of the silver carp. These are the ones that fly out of the water when you're riding a boat through. Kind of funny, but also could certainly be dangerous. There's been an incredible amount of science and an incredible amount of investment trying to stop them from getting in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes Mississippi River Interbasin Study, we know that these carp are, gosh, they're all over in the Mississippi River. And if they get from the Mississippi River into the Great Lakes through the Chicago River, we're in big trouble. So what engineers and scientists have created is a sort of a multi-step process to keep them out. First with an air bubble curtain that turns them away. If they get through that, there's what we call an acoustic fish deterrent. I think they like blast heavy metal, you know, and the fish freak out and they turn around. And if they get through that, there's actually an electric fence, underwater electric fence. So boats could pass through and you wouldn't feel it necessarily, but the fish are deterred. So we have found Asian carps in the Great Lakes that are triploid, meaning they can't reproduce. But if they were to get a foothold, we would be in really big trouble. And you know, there are other programs to try to stop any of these aquatic invasive species. You know, Ohio Sea Grant actually runs the Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers program, encouraging boaters to wash off their boats if you go from one body of water to another, or your fishing gear, for instance, your waders, your lines, all that sort of thing. You know, I'm an avid fisherman. If I'm fishing in a pond in, you know, central Ohio, for instance, and I come back to Lake Erie, I always wash the gear because you don't want anything hitchhiking and finding its way. Okay, on to algae. So algae, super important. There's literally hundreds of species of algae in Lake Erie, incredibly beneficial. They're the building blocks of life. You know, algae are eaten by zooplankton by forage fish, and then larger sport fish eat forage fish. What type of fish is this? It's a walleye. I think I heard someone say walleye. But yeah, so if it weren't for algae, we wouldn't have, you know, all the fish that we have. We wouldn't have the fishery, we wouldn't have the recreation, wouldn't have the economic gain either. So algae is really important, but unfortunately not all algae is made equal. Although there are many different types of algae, again, literally hundreds, what we're worried about are cyanobacteria. They're actually not even a true algae, they're more of a blue-green algae. I guess you'd consider them a bacteria because they use sunlight to make food. Now, the problem with cyanobacteria is they make a neurotoxin called microcystin. This is the actual algae, microcystis, but the neurotoxin is microcystin. And unfortunately, when conditions are right, when there is just a lot of water in the spring and a ton of runoff of that phosphorus-based fertilizer we talked about earlier, and that all ends up in the western shallow basin where the sun could penetrate the water column. You know, this is the same fertilizer that makes corn and beans grow. Well, unfortunately, it also makes algal blooms grow. And when this blue-green algae, this microcystis, grows into huge mats, it literally looks like a carpet on top of the water. So it can turn the whole western basin of the lake green. Again, in addition to being toxic to humans, it's obviously toxic to other animals. From an aesthetics perspective, you can imagine how this would impact the local economy, whether it be charter captains or people who are renting you know, cabins on South Bass to, you know, to go play in the water and boat or fish. You know, nobody wants to go swimming in this, right? So the impact certainly could be seen ecologically, but it's absolutely felt economically as well. Again, this is a point of some pretty major investment at the state level. The DeWine administration passed the H2 Ohio program, or funded the H2 Ohio program, trying to create, protect, and monitor coastal wetlands. So again, trying to stop some of that excess phosphorus from getting into the water that helps fuel these algal blooms. There's also been an incredible amount of money put into different research projects to try to address the issue. Everything from, you know, using big data and field management apps so agricultural landowners know where they have phosphorus and nitrogen on their land and where they might be deficient. So instead of sort of broad-based fertilizer, you could actually target where you need it and how much. Recycling manure, which we know is really high in phosphorus as well. And then on the flip side, trying to detect algal blooms as they happen and also detect how toxic they are. So just because there's a big algal bloom, maybe it looks nasty, but it doesn't mean it's super toxic. Where on the other hand, maybe a bloom doesn't look so bad, but it could have major public health implications because it's extremely toxic. So again, a lot of research, a lot of investment in this space. It's really a tough problem, right? I'm telling agricultural landowners not to add fertilizers, you know, that's not fair either. That becomes both an economic and food security issue. So I'd actually go as far as to say some of our best partners in this space are ag landowners who are, as eager as we are to try to address excess phosphorus and find ways to help reduce the algal blooms. Okay, storm hazards. Storm hazards are an issue in Northeast Ohio and have been for a long time. 9 of the past 11 presidential declarations of disaster in Northeast Ohio have been due to severe storms. This is when there is a natural event that causes such destruction that the federal government releases funds to try to address it. Think Superstorm Sandy or Hurricane Katrina. When those types of events happen in Northeast Ohio, it's generally not an earthquake or a tornado, it's a severe storm. You could quantify this in terms of money, which is just out of control, as well as public health issues. This here is a map of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and I'd argue that they're the biggest players in helping to offset or reduce some of the challenges with increased precipitation. I'd also argue it's fighting against a really sort of challenging opponent, and that is severe storms and increased precipitation. This map shows the increase in the amount of rain falling in the heaviest 1% storms from 1958 to 2012. And this was produced by the good folks at GLESA, the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Lab. Again, I work for Ohio State, and I hate to admit it, but that's in Ann Arbor. They're a Michigan outfit, and they're the best modelers in the Great Lakes. So not only did they whoop us in football, but they also whoop us in climate modeling. So they got that going for them. But this is scary to me for several reasons. This tells us that we're having a lot more of those superstorms that cause flooding, that cause erosion, that create runoff that carries excess phosphorus into the Great Lakes. These are the types of storms that cause what are called combined sewer overflows, where the sanitary sewer and the storm drains overflow and combine into one and dump out eventually either into rivers that go into the lake or into Lake Erie themselves. There's a big one at Edgewater Park, for instance. Our sewers are designed to do this, by the way, so it doesn't flood upstream. So again, the system's working properly, but we're seeing such an increase in these superstorms, these 100-year storms, if you will, that are sort of making us rethink our strategy, rethink our planning, rethink how the future will look in terms of the amount of water we're going to receive and how we're going to deal with it. And it's not just the Great Lakes. I mean, we could break down the numbers just for Cleveland. Not only are we seeing more of these 1% storms, but we're seeing more rain falling per 1% storm. So we're seeing more superstorms, and those superstorms are actually generating more and more water. So again, more flooding, more erosion, more combined sewer overflows. We use the word assets that are disturbed, things like businesses, utilities, transportation routes, public transportation routes. You can imagine how this would impact some of these assets and how this impact will only increase in the future if some of these projections by GLESA hold true. We can't tell the future, unfortunately, but we can predict with a certain amount of sort of statistical significance, if you will, how much rain will fall in the future, so how much bigger and more frequent and more intense these storms will become. NOAA puts out something called Atlas 14. I believe they're coming out with an Atlas 2024 as well, so updating the science. But basically what this tells us, you could plug in your longitude and latitude. So this is just Cleveland. And it'll tell you for a 24-hour precipitation event, within a 90% confidence interval, how many inches of rain will fall in, say, a 24-hour period. So, roughly 5.5 inches of rain, right, could fall within a 24-hour period according to some of these projections. And that's a ton of rain, but that's important if you are a city planner or if you do work for instance, the sewer district and you're interested in capturing some of these excess water. If you work if you're planning a housing development or you're on a zoning commission or any of these things. So how do we deal with all this? One of the things that I worked on, which has hopefully been helpful, create a storm hazards vulnerability index. I didn't come up with this myself or anything. There's a woman at the University of South Carolina named Susan Cutter, and she developed something called the Social Vulnerability Index. And basically what it does is it says that storms are going to happen, tornadoes are going to happen, floods are going to happen, earthquakes are going to happen. It tries to quantify not only the risk in terms of exposure to those hazards, but also the social vulnerability. So the idea of Susan Cutter is that there's various census variables that would help us understand which groups of people in a given area are going to be most susceptible to some of these risks. In the social aspect and the environmental aspect, then you could really kind of come up with an index and look at different communities side by side and hopefully rank them. So that's what we tried to do for the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. Some of the good folks there were kind enough to work with me and provide data from their stormwater inventory and inspection project, as well as work with me on the GIS maps here. But the first map, this shows social vulnerability only. And again, these are all variables established by Cutter down in South Carolina. Things like age, over 65 and under 18, basically just because people have harder time getting out of the way of major hazards during those age groups. Gender, who do you think's more vulnerable, women or men?
Men.
Men. Why do you say that?
Because they're going to stay in the house after people tell them to leave.
Actually, it's the dead-on opposite. Cutter says that women are more vulnerable because men are quick to hop in the car and get out of town, and women actually help other people. So men, being so selfish, are actually less vulnerable, where women, being more helpful and more caring, put themselves more in harm's way.
Now I've learned a thing. Thank you.
You could thank Susan Cutter and her team for that one. Household income, obviously the more income you have, the less vulnerable you're going to be. Race, ethnicity, minorities, underserved communities are more vulnerable, and people who are transient rather than home owners are also more vulnerable. We mapped it all out, and basically, again, this is every community within this area. We are able to, again, use census data to track per community and rank them. The darker the color, the more vulnerable those communities. I find it kind of interesting. Downtown Cleveland makes sense, but then you have all these inner ring eastern suburbs, right? And these are the areas that sort of moved out from downtown first. This was the place to be maybe 75 years ago, but since we've seen more migration to the exurbs further out and less people moving into those areas, so you have less tax base, you have less sort of resources for resilience, if you will, and these folks are most socially vulnerable. It's interesting, there's actually I don't know what you'd even call them, an organization, I suppose, made up of all of these eastern inner-ring suburbs called the First Suburbs Coalition. And they deal with some of these issues. They have a website, and I talked to one of their directors, and really interesting stuff to hear them talk about how their communities have changed over time. But there's your social vulnerability indicator. Here's our environmental vulnerability indicator. As you can see, it's a whole lot different. A lot of these very socially vulnerable places aren't vulnerable at all environmentally. Instead, you got places like, not only downtown Cleveland, but, Brecksville and sort of Independence down through the center here. Why is that? Why would this area be the most vulnerable environmentally? Yep, you're in the floodplain of the Cuyahoga River. You got it. So the most sort of statistically weighted variable, if you will, would be acres in the 100-year flood zone. The reality is, no matter how much money your communities have, whatever else is going on, if you're within the 100-year flood zone and we're seeing more of those 100-year storms, you are going to be in the greatest area of risk. So we were able to get that data from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources and map it out per community. We then used, again, data from the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, their stormwater inspection and inventory inspection project, to map out erosion hazards, water quality, structural hazards, and debris hazards for each community, add them up, and literally just pen and paper. Well, it's actually more of an Excel file and fingertips, but we were able to quantify everything and add them up and rank them, and this was our environmental vulnerability indicator. Makes sense. We added them all together. We had to standardize them so you could, we had to operationalize them so you could, they're, standard numbers, that you could rank them from highest to lowest. Communities that had higher social and environmental vulnerability ranked highest. Communities with lowest social environmental vulnerability ranked lowest. We added it all up, and we were actually able to rank then from most to least vulnerable communities in the entire area there, from 1 to 43. As you can see, it's kind of a mix of both, although I'd argue that the environmental vulnerability indicator does take precedent over the social. Those communities that are in the 100-year flood zone, they're simply at the greatest risk. And really the whole point of this exercise was to try to provide a roadmap, if you will, for adaptation, to help local communities with their planning and zoning, any model codes, establishing how far back, for instance, setback ordinance, how far back from rivers or streams or whatnot any sort of development would have to be. It also helped direct resources for things like conservation, the best management practices. Unfortunately, when communities are worried about things like schools and roads and healthcare, climate resilience often takes a back seat. There's limited amount of resources. So being able to do a better job using science to inform decision making about where those limited resources go, I think is really valuable. Personally, I've used some of the data from this to hopefully guide what's called green infrastructure. If you've never heard the term before, basically it's just using any sort of natural practice or to restore some of the natural process of allowing water to slowly seep through the ground into the water table rather than just really quickly rushing off of things like roads and sidewalks and rooftops and parking lots, because really that's what's carrying not only nitrogen or phosphorus if we're out west, but also things like gas and oil and pollution. All of this goes into the storm drains. It could be really nasty. I found green infrastructure to be really helpful in some cases. Myself and some colleagues from Wisconsin and Michigan actually got a nice grant from the Great Lakes Protection Fund to try to encourage the use of green infrastructure in coastal zones. We partnered with various marinas, coastal marinas. It made a lot of sense to us for a few reasons. First of all, all water that's coming off of land has to pass through, the coastal marina if it's going to get into Lake Erie. Second, if you've spent time around boats and boat yards, sometimes there could be quite a bit of gas and oil. Even boat paint is really high in copper, which is really impactful in aquatic ecosystems. So if we could use sort of natural processes, green infrastructure, if you will, to slow down some of that water and to filter it. So again, improving not only water quantity issues, but water quality issues in coastal areas, it would be helpful. We have pilot sites in all 3 states. We developed a website. So, if you just Google Clean Marina Stormwater Toolkit, you could spend all sorts of time on there. We have a decision support tool. We have a virtual Clean Marina that shows you a bunch of different things you could do. And then, like I said, we have pilot projects. We have one just up the road here in Huron Lagoons. It's a really sweet marina about an hour from here. And if you look here, here's where all the boats are stored in the winter. And the only thing between the boats and the water is this strip of grass. That's basically everything that's stopping all that sort of copper-laden paint and oil and gas and everything else from running right into the water. And as you can see, eventually right into Lake Erie. So what we did is we built what's called a bioretention cell. The idea being that if you could use sort of a high flow media filter to help capture some of that water as it runs off of the asphalt before it gets into the marina, you could not only slow down the runoff, but you could also reduce the amount of all sorts of the stuff you don't want going in the water. We did subcontract a company called Contech. They use this stuff, they call it Filtera. It's supposed to be engineered to really sort of do an excellent job pooling out some of these toxins and also slowing down the water. Personally, I think it's like just sand and gravel, but I wasn't going to tell them that. We also used a bunch of mulch, but it was a really big project. You can see we made 2 bioswales, one here and one there. And then the cool part is that we also subcontracted with the geodetic engineering program at Ohio State University, and we put in solar-powered auto samplers. So what this did is it measured the water entering the system and exiting the system. There's an outflow pipe going into the water, and it not only measured it for the amount of water, so again, we're trying to slow the water down, but it also measured the ability of this system, this bioswale, to reduce each of these different variables, calcium, copper, magnesium, lead, zinc, stuff that you don't want running into the marina and dumping into Lake Erie. And although this is only one small project, if we were to multiply this by every coastal marina throughout the Great Lakes, I think it would have an incredibly measurable impact. And when it's all done, we planted natural vegetation on top, and I think it even looks better, right? We just finished our first full season of auto sampling. We have some folks in Columbus probably running the numbers like right now. Initial results definitely suggest that it's done an incredibly good job at not only slowing down water, but removing some of those toxins, copper being the most prevalent. So hopefully this is something that we could replicate at different marinas and in different places throughout the Great Lakes. Okay, plastics. Plastics in the Great Lakes. There's a great organization called Alliance for the Great Lakes, and they organize beach cleanups throughout the Great Lakes. What's really cool about them is that anybody could sign up to do it, but instead of just showing up and collecting plastic, when you're done, you actually categorize every little piece of pollution you find. You say what it is, what it's made of, you weigh it, you count it. So over the last decade, throughout the entire Great Lakes, there's this really incredibly robust catalog of all the pollution that's been picked up on our beaches. And so we could say with some pretty good certainty, what percentage of all this stuff we pick up is plastic? Unfortunately, it's 96%, right? And we have an idea of how many millions of pounds this actually is. So, I mean, these numbers are kind of mind-boggling to me. The city of Cleveland approached me and a colleague and said, well, we were reading the Alliance for the Great Lakes numbers, and we want to do something about plastic pollution in Cleveland. We have all sorts of issues with plastic bags and plastic cigar tips. Cleveland actually leads the Great Lakes in plastic cigar tips on beaches. I didn't know that till we did this study. And plastic water bottles. So we sent out a survey to Clevelanders. We got over 1,000 responses and all sorts of interesting feedback. Why don't people always use reusable bags? Well, people just forget them. Right? Nobody said we can't find reusable bags. Almost everybody said we have plenty. We forget them in the trunk of our car, and then you're in the exile, and you're not going to run back out to get them at that point. And people really like using tap water over bottled water, but they forget their water bottles, or there's a stigma about tap water. Cleveland tap water is fantastic, by the way. I can tell you it's very clean and healthy. You could actually see the crib, the intake crib where the water comes from. It's a few miles off the north coast there in downtown Cleveland. So we did this really big study. We got all this good feedback that basically suggested people have plenty of reusable water bottles, people have plenty of reusable shopping bags, they just forget them. And again, if you're a city like Cleveland or even a smaller municipality, this isn't earth-shattering science, but this is definitely helpful information when trying to think about how to use very sort of limited funds, if you will, to try to address the plastic pollution problem. The city of Cleveland took results from that study and they started the Don't Break the Lake campaign. I did not come up with that title. I can't say I'm a huge fan actually, but that's all right. I definitely support the campaign. We put together a needs assessment for the city. They started the campaign. They partnered with a local social marketing firm called ThunderTech. I think they came up with the name actually. And so there's a website and there's all sorts of efforts around Cleveland trying to use data from the project to help reduce plastic usage. We were then contacted by NOAA's Marine Debris Program, and basically the question was, okay, so people say they have plenty of bags and plenty of water bottles and whatnot. Well, how are you going to get people to remember them then? So you did this great survey, and okay, we're going to spend money trying to get people to remember their stuff. How do you do it? So what we did is we used some of the money from this grant, and we made a bunch of signs. Remember your reusable bags. We also made magnets for your fridge, little wooden keychains, little decals for the side of your window. These are a couple of my students from CASE. We actually sat outside grocery stores throughout Cleveland for several months. And we'd set up tables with all these little reminder strategies, and we had our spiel. Hey, there's this many pounds of plastic pollution ending up in Lake Erie. And, everybody says they have bags, but, people forget them. Where are your bags? Oh, I forgot them. See, look. And, so we handed out these reminder strategies. We tried to educate the public. We worked with stores to put up these signs in their windows. We took people's names and emails to do a follow-up survey. And we were really excited, literally we did a couple months of this. This was several days a week. And we thought, this is going to be awesome. We're going to go back to these stores after a couple months and nobody's going to be using plastic bags. It's going to be awesome. And we went back and we basically did observational studies. So after doing all this stuff, we sat in the parking lot with clipboards. We're like, all right, we're going to mark down, the plastic bags we see, and there aren't going to be any. And our study did absolutely nothing. And people used just as many plastic bags after months and months of outreach as they did before we even started. So it just goes to show that this did nothing. But fortunately, we did the follow-up surveys and we got some really good data. So first of all, we asked people, so we gave you the keychains and the window decals and the magnets, and what was the most effective? And people said, none of these are effective. It's a bunch of crap and we don't want it. Save your money. Okay, this is important information, right? If you have a very limited amount of money, don't waste it on reusable bags and don't waste it on remander strategies. People did say they thought the signs in parking lots and in store windows were helpful, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I could tell you, I usually shop up here at Heinen's on Menor Ave, and in the last several years, they put up big signs. And even me who does this type of research, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten out of the car and made it like 1 or 2 steps and that's right, my bags, grab them from under the seat. So it's not necessarily that I don't have them or I don't want to use them, but honestly, that is one reminder strategy that's really been helpful. We also asked folks if they would support legislation to reduce plastic bags, things like plastic bag bans or plastic bag fees. Overwhelmingly, people said yes. There are other parts of the world, or even the United States, where this is commonplace. I have a student in my class at Case from California, and she's like, yeah, there are no plastic bags. You pay and this and that. So, again, we asked, what about support for businesses reducing access to plastic bags? Again, sure, businesses that don't give out plastic bags, we're absolutely still going to shop there. So to me, this was really important information. This told us that the biggest ways to influence plastic usage aren't necessarily trying to hand out all these little knickknacks or anything. Certainly not giving out reusable bags, but rather either government intervention through bans and fees, so financial incentives, or signage that tells people right then and there and helps remind them. The Lake County Solid Waste District reached out to us after this and said, we run these farmers markets. We have all these really neat bags. We spent thousands of dollars on them. They're awesome. We want to see if it's actually working. They gave out over 1,000 bags. We set up a tent at the farmers market. We went to all, Willoughby, Menor, Paynesville. I feel like we went maybe Madison as well. And we did the same thing. We set up a table. We educated people. We gave out the bags. Then we took observational studies. Out of the over 1,300 bags given out through the rest of the summer, which was months of observation, we only saw 50 across all the whole farmers markets. So same thing. People aren't even using the bags that were given out for free. 3% reuse rate, which is ridiculous. And again, this just sort of corroborates what we learned from the first survey, which is don't waste your money on this stuff. That's money that could be going to signage or education or hopefully influencing policy like fees and bans. We even asked, how many bags do people own then? Gosh, people own plenty of reusable bags, I guess, was the take-home message. How likely are people to support businesses that don't give out plastic bags? Again, overwhelmingly very likely or likely. So again, this comes back to the idea that if you are a municipality or government, the way to influence behavior is through either money, through fines or fees for bags, or outright bans. And while this might not sound like earth-shattering science, due to the sort of limited resources available for this type of intervention, in terms of behavior change, that's certainly the way to go, at least what we found. Okay, last but not least, see if I could wrap this up in 8 minutes so we have time for questions. Toxic legacy sediments. I actually work quite a bit in this space. If we go way back to 1972, the governments of the United States and Canada passed the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, sort of the yin to the yang of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act said you're not allowed to pollute America's waters. The goal is to make them all fishable and swimmable. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement basically said, well, how do we clean up the places that are already polluted? So, as part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, Annex 1, if you're into details, the 43 most polluted areas dumping into the Great Lakes were identified. The green or the blue dots are the US side, the red dots are the Canadian side, little purple ones are binational. These are called areas of concern. So basically, scientists from the US EPA and from Environment and Climate Change Canada identified the 43 most polluted areas dumping into the Great Lakes and set up a protocol for basically cleaning them up and restoring them. This did a few things. First of all, it really broke down the science into digestible pieces to try to restore very specific elements within aquatic ecology. We call them beneficial uses. Things like the ability to eat fish. Well, if you can't eat fish because it's toxic, why? Okay, let's address that problem. Habitat, if the habitat's trashed, well, why? How do we improve the habitat? So it takes these really huge problems and makes them more digestible. Ohio, unfortunately, was labeled with 4 of these areas of concern: the Ashtabula, the Cuyahoga, the Black River, and the Maumee River. They're all a little bit different. The Cuyahoga's toxic legacy sediments from steel production and rubber up in Akron, whereas the Maumee River is more phosphorus and nitrogen from incompatible agriculture. This Great Lakes Water Equality Agreement was passed in 1972. The areas of concern were established in 1987, so we've been at this a long time. I will say that there is hope. The Ashtabula River, for instance, was delisted in 2021. That term delisted means that it is no longer considered an area of concern. That the good folks working in the Ashtabula did such a good job of addressing each and every one of those little parts that were contaminating it, the beneficial use impairments, that the US EPA, after years and years of monitoring, said, you know what, you have cleaned it up, you have restored this river to a level that is consistent with other rivers in the area and Lake Erie. We're going to go ahead and take your name off of the bad list, if you will. We're not quite there yet in the Cuyahoga. We're hoping that by the end of the decade we will be, however. Here is our Cuyahoga River area of concern. You'll notice it's not the whole river. It's about 46.5 miles of it, and then near shore on either side of where the Cuyahoga dumps out, because as you can imagine, anything that flows out of the river is going to get pushed back onto shore, as well as all these little sub-watersheds that drain into it. So Doan Brook and Euclid Creek and Big Creek, West Creek, for those of you who spend time downtown. So here are the list of those little parts, all those little things that were deemed wrong with the Cuyahoga River. BUI, beneficial use impairment. So impairment to some sort of beneficial use of the river. The good news, we've already removed 5 of them. The bad news, we got 5 to go. But I'll run through these real quick and tell you about what we did to remove some of them and what we have to do to remove the other ones. First being fish consumption. As of 2020, the US EPA deemed fish caught in the Cuyahoga River to have no greater restrictions on fish caught in Lake Erie. That's amazing to me. In 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, a fish study was done in the Cuyahoga River. They found 3 species of fish. So basically carp. They did it in 2021 for the 50th anniversary. 2022, and they had over 70 species. So just the improvement in water quality to allow that incredible improvement in fish diversity blows my mind. And the fact that after years and years and years of monitoring fish tissue, that we know that fish caught in the Cuyahoga are just as healthy to eat as a walleye you'd catch in 70 feet of water in Lake Erie, to me that is a huge, huge improvement. And as someone who likes to both fish and eat fish, this was really big for me. Next, delts. So let's see, deformities, eroded fins, lesions, and tumors. Not the prettiest BUI to talk about, but again, the US EPA just this year in August gave us approval that fish caught in the Cuyahoga River have a no greater amount of delts, fish tumors and whatnot, than fish caught in Lake Erie or any other comparable water body in Ohio. Again, from a river that in 1969 caught on fire. And it didn't only catch on fire once. I mean, it caught on fire over a dozen times. There was such a heavy sort of slick of oil and gas and everything else on top of the river that it was that nasty it could catch on fire. And now we have over 70 species of fish, and those fish have no more tumors and are no more problematic for humans to eat than fish in the middle of Lake Erie. I mean, that's awesome to me. That is such a success story. Undesirable algae. That's actually my boss's hand. Basically, we were able to identify areas throughout the Cuyahoga River that dumped excess nutrients into the river, causing algal blooms. We were able, over the past several decades, to alleviate those sources. Every year we give out a Champion of the River Award. This is the Cuyahoga River Area of Concern Advisory Committee group. We give out a Champion of the River Award to folks who've been really helpful to remove any BUIs that year. And the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District and the City of Akron got it a couple years ago because of their efforts to reduce stormwater runoff, that carry these excess nutrients that fuel the algal blooms. Again, such an incredible improvement. US EPA gave us the green light on that one. Next would be public access. We've worked with a group called the Cuyahoga River Water Trail to try to increase public access along the river. This is a picture of a paddling event in downtown Cleveland called Blazing Paddles. Basically, I know, right? They had over 1,000 people from all over the United States. People from faraway Texas come. They work with the shipping industry to shut down the freighters for a whole day. It's actually a 2-day event. And, people paddle, there's races, live music, food. It's an awesome event. So awesome, in fact, that this year, 2023, USA Today, in a reader poll, the Cuyahoga River was ranked the #1 urban kayaking river in the United States of America. So if you like to get outside and get on the water, if you've never kayaked through downtown Cleveland, it's amazing. It'll blow your mind. It's really such an incredible view. You wouldn't know it's there. But again, this never would have happened without the dedication of a lot of really, really hard-working individuals. Aesthetics. This was based on surveys, public surveys. The idea being that, again, if you go back to '69 when the river was just chock full of oil and gas and sheens on top of the water and all sorts of debris, that's been cleaned up sufficiently to the point now where people have said the aesthetics have improved enough. EPA removed that. Okay, here are our remaining ones. Degradation of fish populations. To me, this comes down to dam removal. We've removed a few dams in recent years, especially in the National Park, Stanford Road Dam, as well as the Pioneer Feeder Dam. This is called the Gorge Dam in Cuyahoga Falls. I believe once that is removed, it'll create such an incredible more amount of space or habitat for fish that we'll see fish populations increase dramatically. It'll also improve or return native flows to the river that'll help wash out a lot of the toxins and impurities when those big storms do come. So I think, again, Gorge Dam, it's incredibly expensive because you have to remove decades and decades of sediment that are captured behind the dam that are unfortunately laden with toxins from Goodyear and other industries in Akron. But once that takes place, that'll go a huge way to improving fish populations. Those little suckers are called benthos, little macroinvertebrates. They live on the floor of the river. This is kind of a tough one, especially because the northernmost 6 miles of the river channel is dredged every year, so ships could bring ore up the river and steel out the river. But certainly through habitat protection beyond that 6 miles and improved water quality, we're hoping to see that the benthos BUI will be removed as well. Restrictions on dredging. The Army Corps of Engineers dredges the river at least once a year. That's so the major ships could come up and down. The problem is that sediment that's dredged is so toxic, you basically have to store it in what are called confined disposal facilities. So if you go to the north end of Burke Lakefront Airport, there's these huge basically holding tanks where all this stuff is dumped because it's too toxic to either be dumped in the lake or to be reused for upland uses like fill for construction and such. So again, as we continue to remediate the river, to remove toxins, especially from the old river channel, hopefully we'll get to the point where that sediment is no longer so toxic it can't be used for upland uses. There has been a lot of work going on and really a big collaboration to create a series of confined disposal facilities that are shaped like islands just off of Route 2 in downtown Cleveland, kind of where Burke Lakefront Airport is now by MLK. The idea is that you would then cover them with soil and native vegetation, turn them into recreational opportunities. I think that would be awesome. Beach closings, again, I think the sewer district is the big push here. They're in the midst of a $3.5 billion project Clean Lake, which is creating huge underground storage tanks. So when we have those 100-year storms that we're seeing more frequently and that are more intense, it'll actually help capture the water that they could then slowly release and treat before going into Lake Erie. This will prevent those nasty combined sewer overflows that cause beach closings. So again, they're really leading the way in this area, so hats off to them. Habitat loss, we've done a ton as a group to try to improve habitat along that shipping channel. These are habitat boxes to let baby fish called fry help hopefully get a little respite from not only predators but also from the thrusters of those big ships. We made floating wetlands, for instance, that we've also put along the river's edge in riparian or riverside areas. Again, this is sort of a long-term process. It takes a lot of time to restore habitat that's been completely destroyed. But as of now, we have about 72%, I think, of all those sub-basins are within attainment, if you will, of EPA levels for necessary habitat. So we keep working at it. If you like this stuff, I am part of the Cuyahoga River Area of Concern Advisory Committee. We have a website. I highly encourage you to check it out. We have a lot more details on kind of the science behind all these management actions. Of course, we're all over social as well. And I'd like to end my talks with sort of a note of hope. I don't know if any of you remember reading the Lorax when it came out back in 1971. I wasn't quite born yet, but I remember my folks reading it to me. And there was a line in it about Lake Erie and, how the fish don't want to swim in Lake Erie because it's so very dreary. Well, after years and years of improving Lake Erie, there was a couple grad students at Ohio State that actually wrote the author, Dr. Seuss, and said basically, this isn't fair. I understand. In the early 70s, it was a cesspool, but we've come so far. We made so much improvement. And Dr. Seuss wrote back and said, I agree with you that my 1971 statement in the Lorax about the condition of Lake Erie needs revision. I should no longer be saying bad things about a body of water that is now, due to great civic and scientific effort, the happy home of smiling fish. I'm in the process of purifying the text. Fortunately, the publication text, the blah, blah, blah. Basically, every version of the Lorax that came out after this no longer says anything bad about Lake Erie. So I figure if we could convince Dr. Seuss to change the actual text of the Lorax, well, we could accomplish quite a bit. That's my spiel, folks. I hope you enjoy my talk. Questions? Yes, sir.
Thinking about like those chicken and horse farms and stuff with those big manure pools, are they ever going to really start doing anything about that? To me, I think it's a joke. You dig a hole in the ground, and if it starts leaking, nobody's monitoring it. So it's like, yeah, I got my pool, but it's all running out, so what's the difference? I don't get how they keep getting away with that. Sorry.
No, I hear you. I will say this, that there has been a lot of financial investment into research to try to address that, whether it be through recycling the manure itself or just, reusing it. I think it's tough to change the status quo. I mean, that goes for policy across the board, healthcare or anything, right? It's much easier to maintain the status quo than it is to change it. And in terms of agricultural landowners storing their manure in ponds like that, that's been the practice pretty much forever. So there is a lot of research to try to address it, but it's slow moving, right? And I would again, hats off to Governor DeWine, who has dedicated quite a bit of state financial resources to the H2 Ohio program to try to, part of that money goes to trying to use coastal wetlands to try to capture some of that runoff if they do overflow or they do seep through. It's slow going. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I know people are working on it. Yes, sir.
I just read an article in Inland Seas where the city of Chicago signed a 100-year agreement with Joliet, Indiana to divert water out of the watershed, and
Right.
obviously that's not it's in the Mississippi River shed. And is there anything that the Sea Grant, are they working to prevent that from happening? Because there was the compact in 2008 that's supposed to prevent that unless they can prove the city's requesting, no other alternative that could divert water.
Well, you are correct. So the Great Lakes Compact, 2008, basically said that all the governors of Great Lakes states had to unanimously approve if there was any water from the Great Lakes watershed that'll be diverted out of the watershed, it has to be unanimous approval. In the case of Joliet, my understanding is it's literally within a couple miles of the watershed. So, this isn't diverting water to Las Vegas, God forbid, right? So I feel it is a bit of a gray area because it's so close. I wish it wouldn't have happened because I think that opens the door a little bit. Unfortunately, Sea Grant is more of a research organization than an advocacy organization. I am nonpartisan and I am not allowed to advocate for things like that. But I am allowed to do research that might show that this type of thing could have detrimental effects, for instance. I would argue that the environmental community wasn't happy about it, but given how close it was to the watershed and given the very limited amount of allocation, it's like, okay, not a big deal as long as it doesn't happen again. Anytime there's a but in there, it scares me.
You know, we have property up on West Harbor, and our water level's been down 3-4 feet the
Yeah.
last, this whole summer, and, you know.
But I bet it was really up about 5 years ago.
5 years ago.
Well, no, because this is interesting, because this is predicted to be one of the impacts of climate change, climate weirding. You're going to see higher highs and lower lows. So, it's tough if it's tough if you're a boat owner, that's for darn sure. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned climate change. What are some of the actions or plans that your organization and others are trying to undertake now to try and offset potential, poor effects in the future due to climate change?
What time we got? Said we could talk till tomorrow. So right now in Dubai is COP28. So, convening in the parties or whatever. So people, over 200 representatives from countries around the world meeting to discuss climate change and ways to offset it. Guess who's not there? Biden or China. So the two biggest global emitters aren't there, and you're asking what Sea Grant could do? It's unbelievable to me. So let me say this. So the plastic bag issue, we tried all these little things. What's going to work? Government saying no more. Government saying it's going to cost so much you're not going to do it. We're going to ban them together. If you're asking me how to really make a dent into climate emissions and to kind of really slow it down, you would need buy-in from the United States and China. And the fact that they didn't even show up to a global, convening in the parties, if you will, over 200 countries in the U.S. and China. To me, that suggests that the biggest, most powerful players don't care enough to make an impact. It's a horrible answer, isn't it? But in all honesty. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So what is the pH of Lake Erie? I know that the oceans are alkaline.
Yeah.
So fresh water, to me, has probably got to be right in the middle there, or I don't know.
I have got no idea. But if you give me your email, I will find out and email you.
And then what is the average level of Lake Erie? Is that continuing to rise? Because I go along Menor lagoons there, and I see all these trees washed into the lake. So
Again, unfortunately, about 5 years ago, we saw the highest recorded lake level in Lake Erie, and since the Army Corps started recording, and this is like 100 years ago, something like that. I actually had another presentation. I have a slide. It's not on here. But there's kind of like a steady increase, but you see the variation go higher and lower. Menor lagoons is interesting to me because obviously the cliff had experienced erosion for years, right? But you may notice that the lagoons, city of Menor, developed that huge rock wall with riprap, basically going from the the causeway where boats come out of the lagoons. It goes all the way back to the start of the park. And what that does is anytime you have wave action coming from the northwest, it hits that and it just runs down the rocks. And where does it end up? Right on that cliff. So it just exacerbates erosion big time. So when I saw them doing that, I thought this isn't going to be good. But obviously it is protecting the marina, which is it's
I heard that
pick your poison.
The land in Lake Superior is rising, which causes more water to come down to the lower lakes. Is that a true statement? I don't know.
I don't know about the rising, but yes. So Lake Erie gets roughly 80% of its water from the upper lakes and 20 through precipitation and such. And it takes more or less 2 years for water to flow through the whole Lake Erie system. It comes in through the Detroit River and cruises out over Niagara Falls. So yes, if the upper lakes receive more precipitation, as all the climate projections from GLESA suggest, not only will we get more water draining into Lake Erie from our own tributaries, but more water coming through the system from the upper lakes, and that would mean, in general, more water and higher water levels overall, even though you should see more variability in that upward trajectory. Yeah. Lake Superior is amazing. Have you ever been up there?
Oh, I went on the track all the way around.
It looks like the Caribbean, doesn't it?
It reminds me of Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, a little bit. But I talked about how Lake Erie being the shallowest and the warmest means we have the most life. You know, we talk about the 50 and 2 rule. Lake Erie has roughly 2% of all the water in the Great Lakes, but over 50% of the fish. Lake Superior has a little over 50% of all the water, but only 2% of the fish. At 1,300 feet deep, sunlight can't penetrate the water column, you know, causing all that algae to grow and creating this really strong sort of foundation for life. So you have way less life there. It looks super blue, it's gorgeous, but it's not nearly as productive as Lake Erie. Not as nearly as threatened either. Anything else? Yes, Michelle.
So what would you say would be like the number one call to action for an individual to help us with the lake?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would suggest that policy is always going to have the biggest impact, right? The government has the most money, and they have the ability to pass policies to say what we can and what we cannot do. So I think your vote matters the most. I think contacting your representatives matters. Yeah, I mean, to me, that's by far the biggest bang for your buck. And, you know, it's interesting. Much of, you know, what I talked about in terms of the legacy sediment or in terms of like the wetlands, a lot of this comes from what's called the Great Lakes Legacy Act or the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. These are two, you know, Congress-approved sources of money that could go to all these projects. And they've been really sort of supported from a bipartisan perspective. Even in a past presidential election, a candidate who definitely would not seem to be very environmentally minded initially came out and said, oh, we're going to cut the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And like within 24 hours, they were up saying, we're not going to cut the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We need this money. And the reason isn't, well, unfortunately, probably isn't just ecological, but it's because so much money depends on a healthy Great Lakes. And the numbers are really staggering. I saw a figure the other day that, you know, economic output from a healthy Great Lakes, something like $12 billion a year or something. You know, with all the tourism and all the construction, all the community development, you know, everything put together, right? So it makes a lot of sense. It's easy to get up in front of your constituents and say, yes, look, your tax dollars are returning way more than dollar per dollar, you know, in terms of community development and economic development. And if you live here and you love a healthy, clean lake and you love to boat or fish or swim, obviously we're sold already. So, great question. Yes.
So the dams, they were originally built because of factories and stuff, and now we've decided that they're not needed?
Sure.
Like, why are we removing them all? And
Well, we are.
in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think the better question is why are they built in the first place? We're removing them because by returning river systems to their native flows, it does a few things. It increases habitat for species that live there. It also allows river systems to flush themselves out. You know, especially we're getting these more 100-year storms. That'll carry out all, you can imagine, a huge superstorm. That's going to take all that excess toxin and trash and debris, and it's just going to flush it right out. So why were they built in the first place? Different dams were built for different reasons. Energy is a big one, for instance. You know, the Gorge Dam I showed you is also known as the first energy dam. So, yeah, I mean, water diversion. We recently removed a dam called the Scranton Road Dam in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park and the Pinery Feeder Dam. And the reason that dam was made is because you had the Erie Canal running parallel to the Cuyahoga River, and they built a dam so they could divert water from the Cuyahoga into the canal so people could transport goods up and down the canal. Well, obviously, we don't need that anymore, right? So it was a really good opportunity to say, well, look, we have this relic of a dam that's impeding fish traffic, that's slowing down flow. It was used for this reason, but we don't need that anymore, so we're going to tear it down. Interestingly, though, on a side story, if you like history, I forget who even got the money, but it was a ton of cash. The Friends of Crooked River built this huge contraption where the Pinery Feeder Dam was. This is in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, right at Station Road there, that will capture water when it's turned on and fill it into the canal so they could do kind of historical reenactments, if you will, of how the water was put into the canal and how it was used to transport goods. It's kind of a cool place, actually. It's nice trails down there. I recommend anybody checking it out. Anything else? All right, folks. Feel free to shoot me an email if you got further questions. I'd be more than happy to answer anything for y'all. Thanks for coming out tonight.